Lovies, it's David McGillivray here with another edition of Little Did You Know. It's a chat show in which I talk to people I find interesting, and I hope you agree. So where are we today? Look, it's a lovely blue sky. How about that? We were promised this, and sure enough it's happened. We're in a major London location. Are you beginning to recognise it? It's London's Hyde Park, and today I'm here with somebody to talk about the old days. And when I say the old days, I mean the 1990s. We're also going to talk about London's Soho district. That subject comes up a lot in this show. And we're also going to talk about the word beige in two different contexts. Are you intrigued? If you are, I don't think you're going to be disappointed because my guest is the very wonderful DJ and art connoisseur, Martin Green.
Hi David.
Hello, Martin. Did I use the right description there? Well, there's no ambiguity about DJ, but what about art connoisseur?
Yeah, to some degree. I'm an art curator and I'm a music curator as well.
You're a curator.
I'm a curator, so I like to find artists and music that's been undiscovered, and either exhibit them or play them or put them on compilations, and that's what I like to do, and I've been doing it since the 90s.
You have indeed. Now, my guest last week was Jenny Runneker, and
love Jenny.
Aha! She's an actress and an artist, and I asked her this question. I'm going to ask you as well. Were you an artistic child?
I was artistic and creative. I always loved drawing and painting, and yeah, I did, yeah. And I always loved movies and music. They were, and I had a little record player when I was about 2 years old. And I was fascinated with records.
What sort of music, as a child, drew you?
A lot of it's kind of music that draws me now. A lot of them. I used to like a lot of kids' TV. There's a lot of music in kids' TV programs in the late 60s and early 70s. I'm talking about things like the Banana Splits, it's things from America, which are kind of poppy, and then things from the UK like Finger Bobs and Bagpuss and those things, which are kind of folky. So there was a lot of music around in the childhood, and I've always loved it. And then when I started DJing, I put things like that into my sets.
I don't know the answer to this question, so this will be exciting. What was your first job when you left school?
When I left school, I left school and went to college, but in the...
Which college?
East Ham Technical College. I did a BTEC art design course. But my first job while I was at college, it was in the holidays, was working in a warehouse in Stratford, Maryland, and we were packing up.
This is East London.
And we were packing up Frankie Says Relax t-shirts into boxes, and so that was just in the early 80s period. So there was huge demand on Frankie Says t-shirts.
Of course. Yes, it was the 80s. There was a music programme on BBC Two just recently about the 80s being the greatest period for music. I tend to agree. What about you?
No, I don't agree at all.
Why?
I think the 60s were, and then into the 70s. I think the most exciting period for music was between 67 and 73. I think music, culture, movies, everything just pushed the boundaries, especially in the UK. So you had, as well as Sgt. Pepper, you had Ken Russell, you had Nick Rogue, you had all of these people, Clockwork Orange, you had Kubrick, you had people kind of in this country forging ahead, and I think that was the most exciting time. The 80s for me was, the early part was brilliant. I loved all the kind of early electronic and Human League, all those things, and then it got into corporate nonsense with, you know, Taboo and all those kind of big stadium bands, and it was all a bit too corporate for me, although there were some interesting things in the indie scene.
I tend to agree with that as well. So it was, we're talking about the 80s, before we get on to the 90s. So as it was the 80s, did you end up in a squat?
No, I didn't, because I just lived in East London anyway, so I grew up there, so I could get on the bus into town and out of town. So a lot of people in the squat scene lived further out, so it was kind of a way they could get in and out. But I knew lots of people, and I used to hang out around the squats.
Oh, did you now? And you're talking about going into London. So did you go to London's most notorious club night, Taboo?
Of course, I went to the second night of Taboo. Because a friend of mine knew Lee Bowery and invited me along. I didn't know Lee at the time, I knew him later. Yeah, I went along and there was no one there. It was very, very quiet. But the handful of people that were there were incredibly fabulous dressed up people. And I remember seeing Andrew Logan there walk in with Dougie Fields and Scarlett, and they were like a kind of, the royalty had arrived, and they walked through the club. And I remember Into the Groove had just come out, Madonna's Into the Groove had just come out, and Jeffrey Hinton, who's DJing, played it 5 times. He'd put it on and then take it off, put it on again. They loved the record so much, and it was quite brilliant.
Everyone I've talked to about Taboo, and I so regret never going, has talked about it being, well, first of all, it was in a club called Maximus in Leicester Square, and they've talked about it being grungy.
It was Circus Maximus. That was the venue was called, and it's where I started one of my clubs. And at the time, it was Disco Fantasia. It was Red Velvet Booth, Mirror Balls. Oh, it was incredible. It was glorious, and Roman columns, and it was a kind of Romanesque discotheque. But it all got ripped out, of course, by the early 90s. But in that period, in the mid 80s, 85, I think, Taboo was.
Yeah, 84.
84, 85, yeah. So, and then when I went back to Taboo about 6 months later, because I was at college in Nottingham at the time, so I went along and then went back to college, and then came back, and it was absolutely mobbed. It completely erupted, and it was difficult getting in, and it was like the place.
Did it feel like the place, Taboo, at the time when it was empty?
Yes,
it did.
Even when it was empty, it felt like the place, because everybody, even though there was a handful of people, there were a handful of the most fabulous people, all dressed up, and it was. But I think that's the best thing. I mean, I've never really put. To me, when something's successful, I mean, my clubs were successful, and I loved them when they were really quiet and they were really good fun. They were fun when they were busy, but when they got too busy, the kind of fun went out of it to me.
We're going to jump now to the 90s, Martin, because it's your decade. So, 90s, it's the Britpop era, and you have talked about the fact that it's looked back on now as, you've used this word before, corporate and also blokey. And I think you want to dispel that myth, don't you?
Well, I was around at the very early part of it, and the club that I ran was a pivotal part of the whole scene. And it was very art school, very cool. There was lots of all-female bands, and a lot of the bands that weren't all-female bands had women in the bands, and it was very, very, and it was indie, it was alternative, it was highly creative, and it was fun. And these bands were on genuine indie labels, and then as the whole thing took off, it became more overground. Then it became more laddie on the back of Oasis, the bands that followed them, and it became just a bit dull. And also, all the indie labels got bought up by majors. The bands all signed to majors, and then it all sort of spiraled down really. But the early part, which was started to develop in the early '90s into '96, when it exploded, was absolutely brilliant. And I was in the centre of it because I DJ'd for Pulp. I was the Pulp tour DJ. I DJ'd for Blur, and I DJ'd at an Oasis event as well. So I DJ'd for all of them, and I was very sort of in the middle of that whole scene. And it was genuine at the time, and it was fun, and it was kind of crazy, and everyone was coming from a similar aesthetic.
We've got to cut to the chase, Martin, because you're best known for one particular club night. It was called Smashing. It ran from 1993 to 1996. Now, I want you to tell me the whole Smashing story. I may interject because that's what I do on this show. But first of all, just tell me, how did it come about? Were you mixing with the kind of people who wanted to start their own club night?
Yes, I was. It was 91 we started, actually.
Sorry.
So, we started in 91, towards the end, around about 30 years ago, around this time. I think it was about November-ish.
It's an anniversary.
It's an anniversary, it is. And I'd already been DJing and involved running a club called Tung Kung Fu.
Okay, so I'm going to interject straight away. How did you learn how to become a DJ? Did you have decks in your bedroom?
No. I had a record deck, one deck.
Yeah.
But I was a record collector, and I was a big collector and a big fan of music. And I always kind of went against the grain. So when I was always interested in the 60s and interested in film soundtracks, and that led me into sort of lounge music. And then I met this gang of guys who were in a band called the Sandals, before they were in a band called the Sandals, and together we ran a shop, a vintage shop. This is like the late 80s, early 90s, and we ran a club called Tung Kung Fu. And around that club scene, people like Jamiroquai, Brand New Heavies, all those kind of acid jazz bands were around that scene. And
so now we can come back to Smashing.
Yeah, and then that scene had started dispersing a bit, and then 91, a friend of mine called Matthew Glamorre, he said that he'd got Maximus. He'd been offered Maximus.
So we're back now at the venue for Taboo. Yeah. But first of all, tell us all about Matthew Glamorre.
Matthew Glamorre, I've known around that time. I first met him. So around 30. I knew him around in the 80s. I remember seeing him around and going to some of his performances. But
performances? What kind, please?
What kind of performances? He did these performances in Heaven, and they had they were quite Ken Russell really. They had girls on spinning crosses, and they were kind of outlandish and outrageous performances, but they were very elaborate. And so Matthew was around then. Then Matthew had kind of gone quite hippie, and we met at some friends, and I was talking about wanting to do a club where I could just play anything I wanted and mix everything up.
Okay, so there wasn't anything like that.
There was
at
nothing
that
like
time.
that at all. We were the first to do it. There was people mixed up a couple of things, like you'd get rare groove and disco, or you'd get funk and soul. But this was 1991, and the house scene, which had come into London in about 88, had taken over. So, where in a lot of clubs you used to hear a diversity of sounds, you'd go to a club and it'd just be boom, 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 boom all night. So, I just wanted to do something which was like a party in your bedroom, really, where you play all kinds of different records.
Yeah.
He liked the idea, and also he'd been offered Maximus on a Wednesday night. So we went down there, and they said, "Yeah, take it over." We came up with the name Smashing, which was named after one of my favourite films, which is called Smashing Time. Of course. And that's it. So we took over from there was a 70s retro disco night called Car Wash, and we took over. So our first night, which was a Wednesday night, it was very, very busy with people that thought they were still at Car Wash, but they hadn't realised the club had changed. So it was myself, Matthew, another DJ called Michael Murphy, and promoter Adrian Webb. So the four of us started this night anyway, and the intention was we wanted to play what we wanted. So we started playing, and I started playing, songs from Hair, Jesus Christ Superstar.
What was the reaction?
Well, there'd be a queue of people in afro wigs queuing up to complain, and a long queue of people queuing up to complain. Mm-hmm. But we stuck to our guns, and the following week, the club was empty. There was about 20, 30 of our friends down there in a club which holds about 800 people. And but we had a fantastic time. We played David Bowie, X-Ray Specs, Burt Bacharach, just mixing up all kinds of things.
Did they listen or did they dance?
They went crazy dancing around. We were doing the hokey-cokey. It was absolutely brilliant. And but in that little crowd was Lee Bowery was there, and Transform, and a few different people. So although it was a handful of people, they were really cool people, and fun, and it was really a good night. And no one knew what was going to come next, and it was exciting. Yeah. As opposed to the contrast was boom, 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 boom all night long, which was predictable in the other clubs. But there was a couple had come down there, and they were friends of Dave Swindell's from Time Out. The following week, and they phoned him up and said, we went to the best club. The following week he came down, loved it, and then started to promote us through Time Out. And then we started to get an audience of sort of disparate people who were bored with the kind of predictability of the house scene. So people like Jarvis Cocker, Brett Anderson, all these kind of people who were Paul Kay, all different people who were sort of bored, and then we used to put bands on, and then it started to take off, and then we moved from to different venues around London.
I do want to talk about one of your most famous venues, and this was an old school cabaret called Eve. So this opened in 1953. In the Regent Street area, and I spent years working for a magazine called What's On in London.
Yeah.
Eve used to advertise in What's On in London. By that time, when now we're talking about the 80s, and it was a sort of gentleman's club. I do believe that if you paid money, you could have a hostess for the evening. Now, were you aware of Eve's history?
Of course, as well, Eve's history. So when we left Maximus, we went to a club called the Gaslight of St James, which was, but bearing in mind, all of this happened in a massive recession. This is the early 90s. So you could just knock on a club door and you'd say, can we do a night here? Yeah. And they go, all right. And also, because we weren't a druggy crowd, we were a boozy crowd, so the bar takes were great. And all the E clubs didn't take, and I'm talking about behind the bar. No. So, the landlords liked us. So we started at the Eve Club, at the moved to the Gaslight Club, which was in St James, and then they suggested other hostess clubs, because the hostess clubs at the time were closed on a Saturday, because all the gentlemen were back with their wives in Surrey. So it was so they were sat empty, and because they had a good bar take, they liked us. So we went to loads and loads of different ones.
Tell me about the dance floor at Eve, though, because it was famous.
So then we ended up at the Eve Club, which had closed down as a gentleman's club and had been taken over, but it had been mothballed, so it hadn't changed at all. So we had these trees, foliage everywhere. It was like the Garden of Eden was the theme of the venue, and little twinkling lights.
Hence the name Eve.
And it had a light-up dance floor, and it was the first illuminated dance floor in Europe. And it would raise off the floor to become a stage, and that's where we put on bands like Menswear and Minty and loads of people all from the whole Britpop world. And it actually lifted. It wasn't hydraulics. It was cogs and wheels lifted this thing up out of the floor, and it was absolutely. And we moved there in '94, and it was that period when all the bands that were hanging out in our scene were starting to take off. So then it became the centre of Britpop, that club, because all of our mates were hanging out there, and they were all the Britpop mates, and it exploded.
We're going to talk more about this after the break, but we're just going to take a brief pause to have a look at the trailer for a Peccadillo picture, and this one is called Postcards from London, and it is, and I quote, a highly stylized depiction of the life of a rent boy in, you guessed it, Soho. Have a look at this and then join us again in a couple of minutes.
Sometimes, as I lay in bed at night, I imagine a world beyond these four walls. A world full of mystery and possibility. And beauty. I want to create my own beauty.
You're a small town boy, and this is a big city. How are you going to survive?
Looking for a job.
This is not a job. This is a vocation.
People crave intimacy. The sex is the easy part.
We will teach you everything that we know.
We start with Caravaggio and work our way back to the ancients.
Didn't realise being a rent boy was so complicated. I can be with you tonight. Anything is possible.
I'm told that every phone box within a mile of Soho has become a shrine to your beauty.
Reminded of a young man in a painting. I wanted to show it to you. Are you okay, Jim? Jim, can you hear me?
Wake up!
You're suffering from a rare condition called Stendhal syndrome.
If it's beautiful, if it's a proper masterpiece, I faint.
Beauty should always be intense. Beauty should always be dangerous.
Just be careful where you point that arrow, Tony. I'm not wearing any protection. I don't think I can do this job anymore. I'm not a rent boy, I'm a muse.
Get back out there and enjoy it while it lasts.
If he wants to be a muse, he'll have to put the work in. Simple as that.
It's not as tough as we originally thought. It belongs to us, and we can do whatever we want.
I think I'm ready now.
Go on then. Ask me the question you've been meaning to ask me ever since you walked in the door.
Why are barmaids in London so unfriendly?
That was Postcards from London, and it's only the second feature in 24 years from director Steve McLean. And as you may have noticed, it's got an early performance in it from Harris Dickinson, who's done quite well for himself. It's now available on peccadillopod.com. I'm David McGillivray, and I'm here with Martin Green. Have you seen Postcards from London, Martin?
No, I haven't. Sounds really interesting.
It's strange.
Oh, I like strange.
I thought you did. Just before the break, we were talking about your club night Smashing and its most famous venue, an old school cabaret club called Eve, right here in London. What was the most famous video shot at Smashing in Eve?
It was Common People.
It was.
Well, they used the dance floor, and that was 95, I think. And the Eve Club was in a little doorway on Regent Street, opposite Hamleys. And so I was talking before about we used to put bands on and acts on. We also used to play party games.
Like?
We'd play musical bumps, musical statues. We did the crowning of the May Queen once, and we got everybody to put their arms up and make an arch. And in the and we did it every year. We used to do a May Day celebration, and in the crowd was Courtney Love, and we asked her if she'd be the May Queen, and she would. So she processed through the crowd as the May Queen.
It sounds like Studio 54.
It was kind of like an indie version of that.
Yes.
And we used to do a conga. So we got so popular. We used to do a conga every week anyway, around the club. And when we were at Eve's, we used to take the conga, or Matthew Glamorre used to start the conga, and he used to lead the conga, and he used to lead it out of the club, along Regent Street, past Hamleys, and then back down into the club. And one of the advantages of the conga was the club became so popular. Some of our friends would be in the queue outside to get in, and we just put them on the end of the conga and bring them back into the club.
Is it true that an internationally celebrated pop star arrived at Smashing, didn't go in, and then left again?
Well, there was Prince turned up.
That's the man.
Prince turned up, and his security, a big limo pulled up outside, and he turned up, and his security came over and said, Prince would like a VIP area, and we said, sorry, he can come in, but we're all VIPs, so we won't make a special area for him. So he drove up in disgruntled.
And that was it.
We had Michael Stipe in there. We had everybody. The whole of Britpop. I remember when Oasis first came to London, they came down to the club, and they just had one record out, and we'd been playing it. And they turned up, and just as they turned up, the Creation put them on the guest list. Matthew Glamorre got out of a cab in a big crazy outfit, and looked at them and said, "Who are you lot?" And they said, "We're Oasis." And I said, and he said to me, because I used to hang around at the door make sure our friends got in as well as DJing. So Matthew said, "You're not going to let these in, are you?" And I said, "Yeah, no, it's fine. We'll let them in on the list. We play their record. We like them." And he went, "Oh, okay." He said, "Right, you lot. Next time you come down, make an effort." So they came in. Oasis came in very cheaply. And then within a few months, their career all took off, and then they were the kind of, aggressors.
Have you been back to what was Eve subsequently?
It's all been knocked down.
What is it now?
The front's there. They've done the usual. They keep the frontage and rip the whole of the interior out.
Yeah,
so I think it's the Bose store on Regent Street.
Yeah. Hey ho, we've got to move on to your career compiling albums. Now, this is of particular interest to me. I think this is where we have to mention a man called Très, don't we?
Yeah, we do. Très.
First of all, how many albums are we up to now? Is it 30?
30 albums, yeah, and I've got some more in the pipeline, but 30 albums, yes. So that the first album I did was called Sound Gallery, and it was with Très and Patrick Whitaker.
Who's Très?
Très was at the time with a friend of a friend. I didn't really know him that well, but I was DJing a track at Smashing called Black Right by Mandingo, which was a kind of house band set up by Norman Newell. And
we've got a very anxious dog here now. His owner has left him, and it's a bit sad, but I'll keep you posted on him. Sorry, Martin.
It's okay.
Carry on.
So Très, I was playing this track called Black Right by Mandingo, and Très came up and said, "This is amazing." It was a big orchestral, tribal funk track. And I said, "It's one of yours."
And there they go.
And
Mandingo.
So I was playing this track. Très came up, asked what it was. I said it was one of yours because I knew Très worked at EMI, and he said, "Come and see me." So I went into EMI when it was in Manchester Square with the famous Beatles staircase, and we sat down and said, "Let's do something." So we put this album together of all these kind of easy listening lounge exotic, funky tracks from the late 60s, early 70s. And then EMI said, what on earth are you doing? You know, these are, who's going to buy this? No one bought them the first time round. And Très spent almost a year saying to them, look, you know, this will work, I'm sure it'll work, I've got faith in it. And he did, and we put it out, and we mastered it at Abbey Road. So it was like because Très wanted to be like the Rolls Royce of compilations, so all from original master tapes. Master Abbey Road with the engineer that worked on the Beatles Abbey Road album, Chris Blair, and then it came out and it sold 100,000 copies. It was enormously successful, and it kick-started that whole easy listening lounge revolution in the 90s.
How did people know it was there? Did they also, EMI, have a publicity budget for it?
A bit, yeah. We had a little party. It's word of mouth. It was word of mouth. No one had done a compilation of these kind of material. They'd all done albums of, you know, you could buy a Northern Soul album or rock and roll album, but no one had really done albums of this kind of like offbeat, obscure, easy listening music.
Again, as with Smashing, new territory.
Yes.
Shall I tell you my favourite of your albums, Martin?
Yes, please do.
If I can consult my notes, which are being blown hither and thither, it's And This Is Me. So,
oh yeah, I did that with Bob Stanley from St Etienne. Yeah.
Tell us what it consists of.
That's an album of personality records from the late 50s, early 60s, and I've always had I've always liked I've always liked film soundtracks, TV records, live music. But I've always liked personality records. So the kind of the more bizarre the personality, and the more bizarre the record, and they a lot of them came out on Pi. And comedians made records, actors made records, TV presenters made records. I've got a record by Godfrey Wynne, who was he was a critic, wasn't he?
It's hard to describe Godfrey Wynne, but he was a kind of a disc jockey who was often on Housewife's Choice.
And a few by Hilda Baker.
Oh.
And so we put this compilation together of some of these personality records, and there's some really, really good ones. Of course, the thing is, in that period, the production levels were very high. So although they were kind of novelty records, they sound great.
Well, this is the only example, Martin, where I got there before you. Because in the 70s I was working for BBC Radio London. I loved this kind of record as well, and so I put together a whole programme called Is This a Record? And it consisted of actors who were not known as singers who had made at least one record. So we both had the same actor. I used him, and so did you. It's Oliver Reed.
Oliver Reed, the wild one. I mean, the thing that started me off on this was, I think, was when I was must have been about 15, 16. There was a couple. I went to a sort of junk shop, and there was a Peter Wingard album in there.
Famous.
And it was for like 10p or something.
Yes.
And I thought, I can't resist this. So I got it, and it was crazy. And I just thought, there must be more things like this around. And they're quite rare. I mean, there's a very good one called David Hemmings Happens. Which,
I don't know that.
Yes, and where some of the backings by the Byrds, it's like 1966. So there's some really good, and there's a great mad funk one on an Irish label by Peter Adamson, who's Len Fairclough in Coronation Street. So, and one of my other favourites is by Jack Warner, called You Got the Gear, Son.
Oh, I don't know that.
Where he gives advice to his teenage son about, about being cool and,
This is PC George Dixon of Dixon of Dock Green, yes. I had one actor you haven't used yet, Sir Michael Redgrave.
Oh, really?
Yes, he sang the theme from a film he was in, No, My Darling Daughter.
I put that on a compilation.
I was wrong again. You've had it.
I did these 2 compilations called Troxy Music, and it's on one of those.
How wonderful.
Yeah, it's great. With Juliet Mills or
Juliet
Hayley
Mills.
Mills?
Juliet
Mills.
I could sing it, but I'm not going to.
It's a very camp record.
It's camp as Christmas. I do still have it on a 45. Martin, I've been going online, as I'm wont to do, looking you up. And oh gosh, there you are. Something you did just earlier this year with... he's looking worried. It's okay. You did something with another mutual friend of ours, Dana Gillespie.
Lovely Dana, yes.
Was that the first time you'd met?
It was, and I've seen her perform a few times. I've seen her a few times, and she came to one of our exhibitions. Oh, no, she was incredible. I mean, an incredible talent.
You talked about a lot of stuff on that show, didn't you?
Yeah. It's a great show that she's got, you know.
Tell us about it.
She's working in this venue. She has a lot of events there. A place called TAM, which is called Temple of Art and Music in Elephant and Castle. It's a really cool place. It's like a kind of psychedelic junk shop. So it's great, pianos piled high, artwork on the wall. It's a bit like something from The Rebel. And
when you say The Rebel,
the Tony Hancock movie, it's got a kind of beatnik feel, and it's got a great stage and lots of performances. Dana's performing there, and I'm actually organising an event for there on the 25th of November, which is a tribute to Anthony Newley. Songs of Anthony Newley.
How can we talk about your career without talking about Anthony Newley? So tell us more about this event. What will it consist of?
It's going to be the songs of Anthony Newley and Leslie Bracus, who sadly passed away
Just died.
A couple of days ago. And because a friend of mine who publishes their music said that one of the most requested songs for publishing in America of his company is Pure Imagination, and the other one's Feeling Good. But a lot of people haven't connected that they're both by the same songwriters. So what we do, we want to do a presentation. And it's going to be quite small, a couple hundred people with some big star names, and performing some of his songs with a view to next year doing a big event at the Hackney Empire, because Anthony Newley was from Hackney, and I just think a lot of these songwriters was just unbelievably brilliant and talented, and they get kind of forgotten, but the songs don't. And we just want to kind of reconnect the public with those with that sort of the songs in the 90s.
Good idea. Can I come?
Of course, love you to come.
Oh, excellent. Because, I mean, let's just establish this. Anthony Newley was essentially an actor, but then became a singer who was so versatile, so influential. I mean, surely I don't have to mention that David Bowie was a huge fan and early on imitated Anthony Newley.
Yes. Yeah, he kind of lived as Anthony Newley for a little while.
Yes.
Yeah. And Anthony Newley was, and he did this program called Gurney Slade, which was very surreal.
It's a huge cult. You can get it on DVD.
And Dana Gillespie and David Bowie used to watch it at David Bowie's house with parents when they were teenagers. So I think she's going to talk about that in the Newley show. But I'm not going to reveal the star names, but there's some great people.
No more spoilers. But it was on that show that I saw you on, Martin, that you were talking about art. Now, this is something that I didn't know about. You said earlier in the show you're a curator. Now, how did this start?
Well, it started 10 years ago with a friend of mine, James Lawler, who's been curating for over 20 years, their various exhibitions. We went to an exhibition at the V&A about postmodernism in art and design.
Yes.
And it was a great exhibition. It was very thorough. But one of the great omissions, in my opinion, or in our opinion, was Dougie Fields, because we felt Dougie Fields was his work encapsulated postmodernism. And
this is where I interject again because it is important. I mentioned earlier that my guest last week was Jenny Runnicker. I walk into Jenny Runnicker's flat. What's on the wall? Dougie Fields, and sadly Dougie died this year as well.
Yeah, tragic.
Tell us about him.
So Dougie, I sort of knew from parties that happened in the Glass House, which was a studio belonging to a great friend of mine, Andrew Logan. And so I sort of knew Dougie a little bit, not well, but I knew him to chat to at parties. And when I went to this exhibition, I was so angry that he'd been excluded that I said to James, look, you've been working out of a gallery in Liverpool, let's do a Dougie Fields show. And phoned Dougie up, said let's come and see you. We offered him a show. It was his first show for over 20 years, and we did an exhibition, and it was successful. It started to get some interest in him, and then it led us to start looking at other artists which we felt had fallen through the cracks. And
another example, please.
One of the artists that we did on Dougie's recommendation, actually, he was a good friend who came up to see his exhibition, was Caroline Coon, who was known as a writer and a campaigner,
activist in the 1960s.
Yeah, and she was a famous figure at the countercultural scene.
Yes,
but no one really knew as a painter because she never had an exhibition and never sold anything. So we went and saw her work and said, "Oh my God, it's fantastic! We'd love to exhibit your work."
What did you like about it?
It's just, you just have to see the painting. They're just incredible paintings. They're incredibly detailed. They're incredible amount of work. They've got a great vision. She's and she's got a fearlessness about her. And she never sold anything. She just painted and painted. Anyway, we offered a show, and it was her first ever show, and it was successful. It got the attention of Peter Doig, who was really interested in seeing the work, and then we brought the show to London with him. We curated the show together with him, and now she's in the Hayward, current show at the Hayward, mixing it up, and the Tate have acquired a couple of paintings. So at 76, she's having a lot of attention, which is fantastic.
Are you feeling proud?
Very proud, and especially as when we got in touch with her, she'd bagged up, put loads of drawings in bin bags. She'd got her paints, and she was going to sell her studio, which is her house, and move out of London and give it all up because she was so despondent. Because the thing is, painting went very out of fashion, and figurative painting was even more out of fashion. So these people, it had nothing to do with talent; they were just out of fashion because conceptual work became so fashionable. And now it's all coming back. So painting's very in, figurative painting's very in, and she's kind of riding that wave, which is fantastic.
Excellent. Martin, it's a big question.
Yeah.
We're going to talk about Soho now. It's a famously bohemian area of London that comes up a lot on this show because so many of my guests love Soho. What does Soho mean to you?
Well, Soho, it's meant different things over the years. Soho was a place I used to go to. There used to be loads of cheap record shops in Soho, like cheapo records.
So this is where you started collecting vinyl.
Records, and then going to little clubs and places like the Wag Club and the Beetroot and all these little clubs in Soho. And Soho always felt there was always an edge with Soho, and it was always a place of discovery. And then we did nights in little clubs in Soho, and I DJ'd a lot in Soho, so always passionate about Soho. And then Soho now is becoming more and more corporate and more, they're trying to rip the heart out of it. But when lockdown was happening in London earlier this year, last year, I can't remember.
Both years.
Last year, I think. So when that was all happening, and London was deserted and everyone left, and Soho, because we were doing the show, because I've got a show on Soho Radio, and we do the show, Soho still was like a little magnet for people, and they put the tables and chairs out in the streets and the restaurants and the bars, and the whole of London was deserted. Belgravia was deserted, the city was deserted, everywhere. Camden, where I live, is deserted. But Soho attracted people, and I think it's because of the scale of it, because there's no high rises anywhere. Everything's a few stories high. It still feels intimate. There's still a feeling of, even though a lot of it's changed, there's still a feeling of a sense of a community there, I think.
We're coming up to the end of the show, Martin, alas, but before we stop, I must just include your show on Soho Radio. So tell us about the program you do with, and this is where this word comes up for the first time. The rest about beige is going to have to wait for Patreon. I'll come back to that in a minute, but just tell me about your show with Lenny Beige.
Mr. Lenny Beige, who I've known since the 90s, of course. And he did an amazing club called the Regency Rooms, where a lot of the famous comedians from now came through that club, people like Matt Lucas and Evan Walliams, all those people. Lenny was doing a solo show on there for a while, and I went on as a guest, and I said, why don't we do something together?
What do you do?
Well, together we come up with themes for the show. I source the music, and we get guests on, and we just chat about, play interesting music and chat with interesting people. We've had some great guests.
How can we listen to Soho Radio?
It's on Tuesday, once a month, and it's on Catch Up. It's called the Beige Green Room.
Get it? Beige and green. We're going to talk more about this, Martin, on Patreon, because we've run out of time. That's how it happens. Join us now, Patreon subscribers. You'll find us waiting for you, and if you're not a Patreon subscriber, I have to use my other hand now. Here's the link. It's coming up now. There it is, and it will show you how easy it is to become one of us. Join me again next week because it's the 50th edition of Little Did You Know. It's the backstage edition. I'll be talking to the man who's basically responsible for this show going onto YouTube. It's Tom Abel of Piccadilly Pictures, and on Patreon I'll be talking to Ian Sterland, who does all the technical stuff. Join me then. For now, though, however, from me and my guest Martin Green. Mwah. Bye.
Right.